trust was the final message. Do we trust the local people? There was a point here, or does anyone want to respond on the panel? No?
Can I just... when I go to parties, I don't necessarily admit that I'm a planner, but I test the ground before I do admit that. But I think it's nothing new. We're doing this already. I mean, I work for North Dorset District Council, and we're actively promoting local parish councils and communities to produce their own village design statements. I mean, Stonminster Newton, this building, and what's going on in the town is a classic example of communities doing it for themselves and telling us what they want through the planning process, through the production of a town design statement and a design and development brief for an area of the town. And actually that's been driven by the community, not the local planning authority. We've worked with them, we've provided the expertise. You know, designers have been in there from the beginning. I'm a designer from the local planning authority. I work in that capacity part of the time. We employed designers to actually work with the community to develop the plans. So we're doing it already. But it's actually it did take a leap of faith.
What slightly concerns me about that very rosy view of the village, and you know, we're in the southwest, we have lots of examples of those lovely stereotype village kind of situations with the village shop in central and the rest. When I take that and I apply it to something like Keighley in Yorkshire, which has a very divided community culturally, and there is a certain amount of sectarianism there, I can see a problem in that there's a means to divide what's already there rather than unite what's already there.
The difficulties, I think, is if you simply were to go out and ask people, what do you want your city, your town, your village to be? Most people don't know. And the reason for that is because, first of all, nobody ever asked them before. Secondly, they don't feel particularly confident in handling the vocabulary that is normally used to discuss those things. And thirdly, they don't have a lot of information to go on either. So one of the key mechanisms, usually, and there's quite a lot of development of this has happened for about 30 years now, but mainly in urban situations, is to share the information, to make sure that people can come to, say, workshop situations where the professionals, the experts, and the dwellers are on equal terms, because they've all got equal access to the information. And from that they can talk as equals across the table. And usually that leads to all sorts of unpredictables coming up.
Hi there. I'm interested in this idea of what can we do to support local people realise their neighbourhood plans. And the notion of introducing a designer was mentioned by Oliver Letwin. And to me this raises a very important point in terms of what kind of support will be available to local people to realise their plans. And I think this is kind of one of the big questions that remains unanswered. Because in terms of my experience, I work for Arts Council England, we frequently get individuals, small groups of people coming forward with projects that are going to affect their local community, are going to affect their locality, but what they desperately need is someone to talk to. They don't necessarily have the knowledge, experience, the expertise to know what to do next. And I think a key question is, well, if you give people that freedom, they're going to need some kind of support from someone. They're not going to do it on their own. And the question for all of us is, given the kind of context we're in with cuts and reductions of staff and everything else that goes along with that, who or what is going to be there to support this process? Because it's not going to happen on its own.
I mean, can I just add that that's kind of what we do as a business, but actually we're finding, as an arts business, we're finding now we're not getting the gigs from the local authorities because they haven't got any money anymore. So I think this whole system, I shouldn't really be giving my bit, but I think this whole system would be great if you actually had that support that you're talking about, to help people make those decisions. So it's your mic, isn't it?
I just wanted to make a very brief point as to if people have talked about not being able to perhaps trust local communities, or that there isn't trust there, But I wondered what made people think that there is trust in the planning officers and community. Because my experience of that is that there certainly is not.
So I'm not surprised there's this huge trust. And as I think Malcolm says, it takes time. Certainly our experience of working with communities on the development of village design statements, town design statements, parish plans, you have to invest a huge amount of time. And that is a question that we have to try and address, is who's going to pay for that? Who's going to provide that degree of expertise? Who's going to foster that feeling of trust between planners, both local authority planners and private sector planners, because they also have a role. So who's going to fund that? And I think, in a way, that's where we see the Design and Heritage Forum sort of at least plugging a gap, is that it acts as an honest broker, for want of a better description, in working with communities, providing a degree of expertise, both in terms of planning, in terms of involving artists within the process. So I don't think there's any sort of simple answer, but I'd like to think that the Design and Heritage Forum, at least for Dorset, helps to address that issue.
I just wanted to respond a little bit to this idea of trust before I made the suggestion, just because I seem to have kick-started something that Mr. Letwin took a certain way, which I didn't intend, which was about trusting local people. I think the comment was about are a few influential voices going to hijack essentially what is seen as community voice without actually being the community voice.
So it's more about trusting the mechanism.
I think that's it. And it's not about not trusting local people. It's about saying, are they actually going to get heard through that mechanism? And following on from that, I think Mr. Miles, when he was giving at the end of his speech, said that the role of art was questioning the assumptions and imagining alternatives. And I think one of the things about thinking about the influential voices, that often that tends to be the voice of small c conservatism. And if the role of the artist is to challenge that, maybe one of the ways to move forward is to have an artist at the table in those discussions as standard, have that view coming
Artist
in.
as standard, get that written down.
In the sense of, in the way that some places will have an artist in residence, having a kind of planning artist in residence, that kind of approach to saying that actually, if you have the voice of someone who's going to question and provide an alternative and imagine a different future and give those alternatives, it hopefully could plug a bit of that information gap and help communities to then respond to that and come up with their own alternatives.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the key question that we're sort of discussing here today is how do we engender that creativity within this type of neighbourhood planning process? And we've kind of picked up on the fact that maybe won't be provided anymore through the local authority system. I think one of the key things will be to continue to encourage developers to actually pay for this type of process. So to get your pound of flesh out of Tesco's or whomever it is.
So the artists will be brought in by the developers in order to sort of
absolutely. I mean, if we
articulate their views.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if we were to take Mr. Letwin literally, he was saying that he's going to be telling developers to charm their way into the community. And I think artists and creative people, in the types of process-based ways that we've been talking about and the way that people speak, operate, they're the ideal charmers. It's an excellent way of getting people involved. It's an excellent way of reaching marginalised groups as well. And I think there's very clear evidence for that. There's lots of reports that say hard to reach people. Get creative people there to do that consultation or facilitation or whatever it is you want to call it.
How do the artists feel about that? About being okay? How do artists work with Tesco's or whatever?
I was going to say, are you actually suggesting that Tesco's employ an artist? I mean, that is open for all sorts of misuse.
Stranger things have happened.
Well, they would feel, but... Oh, dear.
And I think there's a real danger for artists and their cultural career, things that are basically upsell. And we need to be quite critical about where control comes in.
Yeah, I mean, certainly.
Can I just respond to that? I mean, I wasn't suggesting that necessarily there was a specific relationship between the artist and the developer. As I understand it, mechanisms like the community infrastructure levy mean that the money will be effectively given to the community at a Section 106 agreement stage. I mean, obviously that's a bit late in terms of the kind of planning process, but I think there will be ways and means of divorcing the money from a particular commercial interest. So, no, it was much more to do with, how to actually get them to, or get developers in general to pay for this type of creative input.
So the money comes from Tesco's, for example, but they've got no creative control.
Well, with the seal system, the money is not necessarily related to a specific place. It can be distributed through the community in a much kind of wider way, as I understand it.
Okay.
I think it's worrying to think that an artist could be the mouthpiece of the developer.
I don't think you're saying that, though.
No, I'm sorry. I'm kind of continuing on from... Well, certainly I'm going to talk later, and in a way, I've been involved in a project with a developer, which is a kind of new role for me as an artist. But I think you've got to be very clear about your position there, in that your role is actually to consult with the general public, rather than giving the view of the developer and being on their side.
You've been working with a developer. What do you think it will create a change, or is it too hard to kind of see?
Well, I think it may have to. I mean, at the moment they're working very much the old way. I and the architect I'm working with have been brought in as a bit of window dressing. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like. I mean, we'll obviously try and use the situation to kind of change the way they think and do something very creative. But I'm very conscious that I feel quite exposed. I've always been quite critical of UK house builders because of the way they make the countryside look. And now I'm working with them with their lift-on plastic bloody chimney pots. There are real contradictions there, and but as an area to work, it's kind of edgy and interesting. So I mean, it could go either way.
Okay,
sorry, just quick. I think we have to start somewhere, and I think Persimmon, who you're referring to, aren't you? Had the original mindset they make a contribution towards the arts 1%, or a sort of financial contribution bit, sort of £10,000-20,000. As far as they were concerned, art was the production of some nice stone benches, and that was it as far as they were concerned. I think to a degree the localism bill and the expectation of larger developers contacting and liaising with community groups in advance of submission of the application provides an opportunity, I'd like to think, for a radical change, or at least a change to their approach to engaging with artists within the development process at the very beginning, rather than bringing them in at the end.
I am one of those much maligned planners as well. I work in a local authority, not in Dorset, but I wanted to come and find out what was happening here because it looked very good. Recently, as a policy planner, we've been working on our production of a new local plan, and decided that people not commenting on our local plan was a big, big problem, or rather local development framework, core strategy, whatever you want to call it. It'll be something else next week, no doubt. We decided that we weren't getting enough comment from people who really mattered, and that was the people that were going to actually experience the outcome of the plan in the end. So we thought outside the box and started doing schools consultations in a big way. And that bore fruit in a number of different ways. One, we were actually, rather than asking people to come to us and saying, are you interested? And most people would say no. We went to a place where people were learning and thinking anyway, so we could garner the opinion that we needed to find out. Don't just think about the village community as being the adults in it. Think about it as being the children that are going to be the recipients of whatever it is that is decided in the next 20, 30 years.
I mean, there's lots of themes. I think we're going to probably finish off now, but, there's a question of, is local democracy bringing conservatism with a small c? How are artists going to be involved? Do they feel comfortable being employees of the developers one way or another? We've got an image here. How do you explain that one?
Dali's. Was this
I guess that could be Dali in a local council who can give, some kind of support for people who want to see more art. I mean, just putting artists into the behind the.
Okay, putting artists in the council, right? Okay, yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.